So we continue this afternoon with a focus on one of those specialisms, and I'm very pleased to introduce Paul Gately from Leeds Met University, what many of us remember fondly as the old Carnegie College, very strong history in PE and school sport. Paul has a local connection here in Manchester as a promising middle-distance runner. He used to train just a couple of miles from here until injury forced him out of the sport. And he then went, as he thought, to coach in the States, but ended up in a weight loss camp. And as you'll see from Paul's build, he certainly wasn't a candidate for it. But for the last 13 years, he's been working at Leeds Met, specialising in health and physical activity for overweight children. So a very warm welcome to Paul Gately.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here, and as was outlined, sport and sports coaching has always been close to my heart, and last couple of weeks ago in the World Gymnastics Championships was one of my old gymnasts, Ashley Watson, was performing, and I coached him in his formative years, in his first early years of gymnastics. And at a time, I had to make a decision between carrying on down a sports coaching route, which was a real passion of mine, or move into a different route where there was, for me, what I appeared to be a clear opportunity. And I moved to what was the opportunity. There's a lot of great coaches out there, but I think one of the challenges is I don't think we've done very well and we still don't do very well in working with overweight and obese young people. I think, and we hold very dear a lot of the coaching principles, and partly it was fantastic to listen to David talk about the sort of more holistic approach to coaching, because when we talk to our obese children, it's not an experience they've had. And so, if anything today, what I'd like to do is challenge you to think differently about this particular group and how we can start to promote health and physical activity in this particular group. So I'm going to ask a fundamental question which might challenge a few people about where is the focus. I'm going to talk a bit about consequences and considerations for action. I'm going to talk a bit about energy balance, and then role of activity, and then give you a case study particularly aligned to the work that we've been doing for the sort of last 10 years really. So, you know, in the UK there are about 13 million children, of which a third of them, 4.5 million, are overweight and obese. So 1 in 3 young people within a classroom setting, okay, not necessarily in a sports coaching setting, but within a classroom setting, will have a weight problem. And I'd ask a fundamental question: the degree to which they are engaged is a key question. Out of that third, we have about 140,000 children in the UK that if they were adults, they would be immediately eligible for surgery. 140,000 of them. And actually very little support or guidance or activities for them. One of the big questions, I think we've lots of people talk about obesity and talk about how they can make a contribution and talk about the fact that it's an important issue. But what we've got to think through is, what is it we're trying to do? Okay, what are the aims? And David spoke about the aims that we have to communicate to young people. And actually, I think we've done a really bad job from a health perspective, from an education perspective, from a children's perspective, understanding what is it we're trying to achieve. So in this context, what we have here, just split those numbers. So this is our 13 million children. What we've got to think about is the context in which they're at risk or not at risk of ill health, of future comorbidities, quality of life, educational attainment, moving up or down, the social systems. And what we know is, so for those 9 million kids, they're doing okay. Pretty low risk from a health perspective, pretty low risk from any other perspectives, and in a sense, good quality physical activity promotion, good quality healthy eating advice is absolutely all they need, okay? Once we start to move across up higher to our 2.8 million overweight kids, we now start to have to see them differently. Their needs are different, okay? And they're starting to have greater risk, greater health risk, greater social risk, greater emotional risk, greater psychological risks. Already, they are vulnerable in that environment. So we started to think now, rather than prevention work, it is more targeted work towards that particular group. Then we move up another category. We have about 2.8 million kids who are obese. They will have a shortened life by about 10 years. That's the reality for that group of young people. Now, much greater risk, much higher risk, as I've outlined, of life expectancy, huge impacts on their social, emotional, psychological health. And then we move up to the third group, the 140,000 severely obese children that I outlined. Now, these kids are really vulnerable. And I would expect, at least within most schools, there's 10, 15, 20 of these kids in the school. Really vulnerable, need lots of very specific help, and not receiving anything like that at all. So here's a little question for you. I just want you to jot down on the pads that you've got in front of you. What we've got here is we've got a child, okay, and there's ages there, but they're not that relevant. So a child anywhere from sort of 5, and five's the cut-off point, 5 up to about sort of 12, okay? And what I want you to just think through is, if you have an obese child here, how many of them will be obese as an adult? Okay, so just want you to jot that down as a percentage. Okay, what do you think? You don't have to give me the answers, just what do you think? Okay, once you've jotted that down now, we've got, this point here is the 50th centile. That is completely slap bang in the middle, if you like, the real average. Okay? As adults, how many of them will be obese adults? And then the final group is about the 15th centile, so that's the sort of low end of the normal weight spectrum. How many of them would be obese adults? Again, a percentage. Okay? Okay, so what it shows is that if you were an obese child during childhood, pretty much guaranteed to be an obese adult. The evidence is really clear. Now, what I'm giving you is a broad range. What I've done is I've collated all the longitudinal studies here, okay? Some of them 40 years, some about 10 years, but a collection of longitudinal studies. And actually, the more recent studies pretty much put it in the 90%. Reality is an obese child will be an obese adult, okay? And I would say part of the reason for that is because we have no intervention systems at all. But in the context of the normal weight, it's actually relatively small risk. So very few children who are normal weight track up to be obese to a point at which their physical, mental, emotional, and social health is dramatically impacted upon later in life. So these kids do not cost us that much money from a health perspective and from a social perspective, particularly related to their weight. And getting that is why separating these groups out is quite important. And part of the reason for this is because what we know is that actually as people increase in their weight, it's only when they reach the obese category that physical health consequences. So here's data on their sort of cardiovascular disease risks. And they're actually, you've got to be quite way up the weight spectrum to start to see those physical health factors. But what's interesting is that in terms of what do we, out of those target groups we can work with, the investment has been at the low end. The investment has been at those kids that don't have a weight problem. So this is data we took, so this side is data taken from the public accounts, public finance review, basically. So looking at the data spent on a whole raft of programs. Now, in here are healthy schools, school sport, school food program, okay? Fantastic programs in their own right, but they are labelled, or they were labelled by that government and labelled by this government as anti-obesity programs, okay? And we spent about £1 billion a year on those collectively between 2005 and 2010, okay? So this was for 68%, because they've already got a problem. So we're spending $5 billion on 67% of the population, of which only 12% of them will cost us any money or be at any risk. At the same time, a third of that population, we spent 30 million, which is 0.04% of the budget over that period of time, we spent on those highly vulnerable children who are pretty much guaranteed already to die young and have a very low quality of life and do very badly in educational terms, and so on and so forth. And so I would argue, and I haven't seen a change in the last 3 years, that we are never going to tackle obesity because it's not a priority. It's talked about as a priority, and we do a whole raft of activities that suggest we're ticking the box, we're promoting physical activity, we're promoting healthy eating, so therefore we must be tackling obesity. No, because the data is pretty clear that those children that were benefiting from these investments were already going to be okay. Now, that's not to take away, I'll reiterate this, from the quality of these programs. They're good, health-promoting programs. I have no problem with them. But I have a problem with them being called anti-obesity programs, because they're fundamentally not. And there's no evidence that they have any impact on young people who are overweight or obese. And one might argue, actually taking serious resource away from them. So what are the consequences? And I'm not going to dwell too much on this because, you know, we all know there's a whole range of physical consequences. And reason why I really like David's talk was because he started to move into this realm of social, emotional factors. And so for me, everyone knows this. If I were to ask an audience, what are the consequences of obesity? You'll rattle off loads and loads of physical consequences. What I really want to talk about, then we also know that at the same time those physical consequences are costing a lot of money. So there was a 1,000% increase between 2000 and 2010 in obesity-related admissions to hospital. But what I'm really interested in is the factors that I think we can have an influence on, is those children's experience, their skills, their competencies, their confidence. And here's some data on obese kids and normal weight children. And what you can see is actually we can see here that there is a difference between the global self-worth or self-confidence of obese boys and obese girls. And you can see right across the spectrum that really for girls it starts to a problem is in athletic competence, which is relevant to all you guys, and then there's problem with appearance. They're the domains that young people are limited in, or obese young people are limited in. But here's some data I think is really, really important, because what we then did, we took all the obese kids and we separated them out for those that have been teased and bullied for their weight and those that haven't. So these are obese kids. And if you look at the kids at the comparison group that have not been teased and bullied for their weight, okay, you can see that these figures actually rate quite similar to the normal weight young people. So it's not obesity per se that impacts on low self-esteem and all those perceived weaknesses in those domains. It's the teasing and bullying that those young people face. Now, when I speak in a sort of school setting or other settings where young people exist, I say, do you have an anti-bullying policy? Yes. Does it mention gender? Yes. Does it mention race? Yes. Does it mention sexuality? Sometimes. Does it mention obesity? No. And yet 1 in 3 kids have a weight problem. So it's a highly common issue, and yet that as a particular dimension is not mentioned at all. So when we think about in the context of a child being safe, they're not safe. They're incredibly vulnerable, and it's allowed to go on. And when I ask kids, what do people say to you? They say, don't worry about it. It's what's inside that counts. That's what gets fed back to them. Be bigger than them. Are the phrases that they receive. Think about in a physical context, data would show that during a 2-year period, looking at the coordination skills of normal weight and obese young people, actually see that those normal weight children's skills improve and the obese kids' skills improve marginally. So the impact of them is very small in comparison to their normal weight peers. In terms of thinking through their physical fitness. So we did some testing of our young people, and what you can see is their peak VO2 in the overweight children compared to normal weight is very, very different, such that the overweight and obese children's maximum or peak level, okay, what they're defining as their sort of maximal, is at a relatively submaximal level for their peers. So the obese kid is working at their highest intensity. It's not even a moderate intensity for their normal weight peers. So the ability to differentiate across these groups is quite hard, accepted. There's also data trying to sort of determine from young people the perceived benefits of physical activity. And I think this is really interesting in the context of, so what we've got is normal weight, overweight and obese kids, and trying to determine from them their views of the benefits of physical activity. So we've got social contacts, pleasures, competition, so on and so forth. And the domains where there is significance is around pleasure, looking better and losing weight. Can anyone from those 3 domains, can anyone just explain them to me? So what would we associate the pleasure of physical activity with? No one. So where does the pleasure come from? Yeah, so the normal weight kids are saying that they gain more pleasure from physical activity, and the obese kids are saying than the obese kids. Whereas the looking better and losing weight are more commonly identified as benefits of physical activity in the obese kids versus their normal weight peers. What's that telling us? Any ideas? Go on, expand on that.
Well, we cover what we see, and obviously looking better, feeling better gives you a positive outlook on yourself, self-esteem.
Does it though? Do people participate in sport in this room because they look better and feel and lose weight? Yeah. So that's more pleasure. I suppose the point is this is more of an internal driver, okay, linked much more with intrinsic motivation, and these are external drivers, okay. And we know from the evidence of participation in physical activity long term that it's the intrinsic drivers, the internal drivers, are much stronger determinants of long-term participation. So we've got a problem here. We've got a perception problem in young people because the norm weight kids get the pleasures we would expect them to get from participating in physical activity. But the obese kids don't. And the obese kids are doing it for external factors. And therefore, it's no surprise that they don't maintain those behaviors over time. I'm going to skip that. We talk to our kids each year and we sort of ask them, how does things go? And give us a quote. And here's a quote. My teacher told us whoever finished last during the warm-up, which was 1 lap of the field, would have to do a further 10 laps. I thought I was doing okay until all the kids in my class sprinted off just before the line. I had to do my 10 laps and I missed playing football. I could give you a whole raft of other quotes as well. So there was another teacher that had outlined in a session that the obese kids didn't put enough effort in. So actually labelled them and said, you know, we were doing a great session, but for the fact that the obese kids didn't put enough effort in. It's better that they didn't call them fat kids anymore, okay? It's now obese kids, so a tiny bit more politically correct, but as loaded messages disengages those young people. They are common themes that are being fed to us all the time. And this is some work of a colleague from Leeds University, and a study on about 126 kids. And great, I think this is a great piece of research. So they had this book, and there was a story read, and the characters were then changed. So the story goes, Alfie, Holly, and Thomas were playing in the garden. Alfie was throwing the ball to Thomas. The sun was shining, and the birds were singing, and Holly was feeding the birds. So then what they did, then they put in a fat Alfie and Alfie in a wheelchair. It was the same story that was communicated, okay? So Alfie and Thomas and so on and so forth. When the children were asked to characterize Alfie, the fat Alfie, they said Alfie would have fewer friends, less party invites, less likely to win a race, and less likely to do good at schoolwork. These are in 6 to 9-year-old young kids. Where are those forms of discrimination coming from? They're not innate. They are socially constructed. And when the character choices, so the odds of Alfie being chosen as a friend, in a wheelchair, he was likely to be chosen 3 out of 10 times in comparison to Thomas. Fat Alfie was likely to be twice in 100. So that sort of form of discrimination is already evident in this group. I can explain this graph. This was a study it's been done and replicated a few times. I think it's a great study. So how the study goes is, I'm given 3 friendship nominations. Okay, so let's say I nominate you 3 as my friends in a group. Okay, you would hope, might not be the case. Okay, you've only just met me. And you're still trying to weigh me up. But you'd hope that, actually, I offer you my friendship, each one of you give me it back. Okay, that's what you want. And the more reciprocal nominations you receive, the closer you move to the middle. Okay, so what we've got here is someone that's got 13, so given 3 out and got 13 back. Pretty popular. 12, 11, 14, 6, 8, and so on. And then you move to the outside, there's someone up there with 6, so they've given 3 out, but actually probably not got back from those 3, has got back from 6 others. Is there a problem with that? Is there a problem when I nominate you 3, but you don't nominate me back, but you 5 do, 5 or 6 do? Is there a problem with that? Yeah, you're nodding your head? Is there an answer following it? So what are the impacts of that then? So you're going to be rejected, but what else will happen? Because you've already got 5 friends. Why is it a double whammy? Because the 5 friends that you don't want to be friends with them. So what will happen is, you nominate you 3, but you don't nominate me back, because you don't want to be my friends, I just want to be your friends, but you don't nominate me back. These guys want to be my friend, but I don't want to be their friend. So I'm going to be left with no friends. So going back to David's point about the social competencies is absolutely critical, particularly in overweight and obese young people. Because we find very poor social competencies, which is why they're often excluded or exclude themselves from being part of the group. And I would argue that is our responsibility to help shape their skills so that they can understand these are the 3 friends that are not interested, but actually these are my 6 friends that are. When you look at this, why it's important is the black dots represent the obese kids and the white dots represent normal weight kids. And what you can see, with the exception of a couple, probably that one, these kids are nominating others but not getting them back. Or indeed, these kids are the black dots right on the outside. So they are outsiders. And it's a good example of how they exclude themselves as well as being excluded. Okay, so we all know that it's about energy in, energy out, when actually it is pretty simple, okay? If you eat more than you burn off, you're going to gain weight. If you eat less, you lose weight. That sounds pretty simple. But if it was that simple, we wouldn't have an obesity epidemic. And there was a study done a few years ago, and it was trying to determine what are the drivers on this sort of energy in, energy out. And you start to realise there's about 125 different interconnected determinants, primary determinants to obesity, or that energy in, energy out. Okay, and there's lots of different factors that influence that. So it's not as simple, and hammering home a message that it's what it's how many calories you burn off through exercise or how many you eat through food intake is not that helpful. Okay, in the context of us living in an obesogenic environment. So just some basic principles about sort of the physical activity dimension. Actually, physical activity is an incredibly poor form of energy expenditure. Okay? We can eat far many more calories in 10 minutes than what we can burn off. Okay? And so physical activity is not great, and it's not great to induce weight loss either. The evidence is pretty clear. Randomized controlled trials show that when you get people to just do exercise versus dietary change or diet and physical activity change, exercise loses out. It's not very effective at all. And yet for me, this whole sort of mantra around you need to do sport, you need to do exercise because you'll burn calories is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. Because what David spoke about was all the other benefits, the broader holistic benefits that actually I think for the last decade sport has sold itself completely short by selling a message of energy expenditure and not a message of teamwork, development of friends, social relationships, experiences, winning, losing, challenges, resilience. They're some of the skills that come out and are yet not really well sold. Time's against me, so I'm going to skip past this. How many people in this room think that exercise makes you feel good? Anybody not? So, I've got a test, okay? So the test is I've marked out a 1 mile loop around this area. Because I was an athlete, I used to run around here a lot. So I know really good. There's two nice hills around here as well that I'm going to run you over. And every time you run past me, okay, when I've got my stopwatch out and I want you to sprint as hard as you can, I'm going to ask you, are you feeling good? And of course you're going to be saying, I feel fantastic. Is that true? Well, I'm not convinced you. Should we go and try it? The reality is we're selling a message that isn't true. The evidence is pretty weak in those sort of benefits that physical activity has. And for obese children and young people, you're talking another language. You are talking as a crazy person. Because their experience of physical activity is not that it feels good. It's that it feels quite painful. And here's an example in an elite population to demonstrate how variable the feeling is. So this is some research done, and so you've got a feeling scale here, and above the line, obviously positive, below the line, negative. And there was 3 elite cyclists doing a max test to exhaustion. And what you can see is, so the average is the orange. You've got your yellow person came in feeling fantastic, really great, got out of bed feeling fantastic, and the first 15 minutes they felt brilliant. And then suddenly, half an hour later, they're feeling pretty miserable. Person in blue coming in can take it, can leave it, starts feeling really good, continues to feel really good, up until a point about 60 minutes. Now look at the difference between 2 elite cyclists at 45 minutes. It's a huge difference there, and they're elite cyclists. And so we keep perpetually talking about this mantra of, oh, it makes you feel fantastic, when it doesn't. And it depends what day you're on. So you're on a good day, you feel great. You're on a bad day, you feel terrible. But if you are physically unfit, any exposure to physical activity makes you feel worse. You're shaking your head. You don't agree?
Yeah. If it's an intense exercise program designed to make you fit, you are going to burn, you are going to feel uncomfortable. If you're a park runner on a Saturday morning in your local park at 9 o'clock, you're going to do 5K nice and slowly, maybe chatting with someone, pushing the pram. It's stress-free. It's fantastic. So it's the intensity of the exercise that really causes that discomfort and mismatch.
But you're describing a general population. I'm talking about an obese population. I'm talking about a perception here. And that's the problem, that we've created a perception that exercise makes you feel good. And actually, that's not borne out by the experiences in school of young people or throughout the life course of obese people.
The vast majority of the park runners I run with, we are overweight and obese.
But I talk about, from a young age, they won't have been. That's the point, is that at childhood is a critical period to influence change, and that does not extend into adulthood for those vulnerable people that I'm trying to define here. I'm trying to separate out a normal weight population from a vulnerable obese population. And that would be where I'd contest the difference.
I'd agree with you on the child one, but you said people in this room.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Paul, do they not enjoy endorphins and
The evidence on endorphins is pretty weak. It's not from a scientific perspective, there is actually very little evidence that endorphins exist in the way that we believe they do. So then one of my colleagues is an expert in this area, and that was the basis of her research. And that's really what that was showing. And particularly the variability in feeling as well, because you'd expect those athletes to sort of respond in the feeling way the same way. That's the difference. And my point is to be contentious, but the reality is that it's the exposure, it's the feelings during that the obese people experience in a very, very negative way. And so that legacy that we define as endorphins, but it's probably a whole manner of things, and it's not just the physical activity itself, it's the park running with your friends, it's the interactions that you have, it's all the things we've been talking about today, is the holistic experience of sport, not just that motion itself. It's everything that comes with it.
sorry to push it, but is it okay to say to an obese child that this is going to be tough when you do it, but you will feel better afterwards? Can you say that or not? Will they?
They'll feel that they'll have the same response dependent on what the exercise challenge is. And if it's relative for them as well as it's relative for their peers, i.e. it's the same relative energy expenditure and intensity or same experience, and we're talking two different things here, and that's the point, that there's a physical energy expenditure component, okay, but then there's an experience as a group. And already this group are undermined, they're socially isolated, they're vulnerable. So if you look at a number of different dimensions, it's unlikely, I would argue, and our kids reinforce this to us, that any of the physical activity sessions they experience as a group with their peers is not a pleasurable experience. That's the problem. No, but that's the point I'm trying to make. It's the holistic experience. But I'm trying to make a point that we are communicating a message that exercise makes you feel good. Everybody put their hand up. And if I asked a room of obese people, they would put their hand up to that belief as well. And it's not what they experience. That's the point. It's a perception. I'm very happy to sort of carry on the conversation.
Isn't it one of your major factors you mentioned before that you did in sport as well? Isn't it from 10 years ago, major sport athletes brought a saying out, no pain, no gain. So now you're saying we have to go away from that.
In a sense, yes, Jane Fonda contributed significantly to the world by this mantra of no pain, no gain. And actually, that's where I learned how not to treat overweight and obese people.
Can I ask, have you ever been in a room and taught obese people?
Have I ever?
Taught them?
Yes.
Done classes with them?
Yes. Every week.
And have you done dead lightly with them? Or at an extent where you set out programs for them and enable them
Yes. But the point is that there's a developmental process, and the way that all you guys will work through a sort of progressive overload program in a sporting sense, and given my background in sport, I've applied the principles to the obese population, okay? However, that doesn't happen because we don't start off the right conversation with the right point or the right tools of engagement with those young people. And so they're already marginalised, already excluded, and that's the point I'm trying to make, that they're an already marginalised group from when they're 5 years old. We've already switched them off, we've already disengaged them, we've already treated them differently. There's nothing to protect them within their school environment. They don't necessarily engage in sport. These are the comments that obese kids tell us all the time.
One of the major factors in obese people, they do not want to be labelled obese. It's a labelling system.
But that's a different point. I don't think what does the labelling matter in the context of what we're talking about here.
Obese people, like you just mentioned before.
Yep.
No pay, no gain.
Yep.
Obese people do not like to be called obese. So it's a matter of fact.
It's a fact. Is it?
Paul, can
Okay.
I ask you, what do you recommend, or forgive me if I'm jumping
Yep.
in, but what would you recommend you say to an obese child about exercise? What would you recommend they do? Am I jumping on?
I know I've got 5 minutes, don't worry. I'm not going to continue, I'm going to respond to your questions now, so I haven't got any more slides. In a context of what do I recommend, I would recommend that the same principles are applied as what you would to normal weight kids. But they have to be done in a context of working specifically with obese kids. That's what we found. That it is almost impossible to engage obese young people within their normal group. It just doesn't seem to happen. And when they're separated, utilising the same principles of what we've been hearing about today, the programs are effective. But then also there is a big need to consider the emotional, psychological factors that are evident within those kids. And as we were talking before lunch, actually teachers are often, not just teachers, but counsellors, psychologists, social workers. And the likelihood of obese kids is that they suffer much more from those factors. So the 140,000 kids are typically, when we characterise them, have got about 60% of them have mental health issues. Okay? A large number of them have been through some degree of trauma, some degree of abuse, some disabilities that they face. Okay, so they need much more intensive support. And at the moment, I would argue that the support is with the group that's okay.
So how do you sell exercise to an obese person?
If you put them, you don't need to sell it. If you put them together in a group of like-minded people, like experienced people, they'll do it. Our kids say to us, when they're in a weight loss environment with their peers, it's great, we're all in the same boat. And I can get them to intensively exercise, okay? And I can get them to enjoy exercise. We can do all those different factors. But it's within their own client group. That's what we found has been the only mechanism to shape their behaviours. So the point I'm trying to make is, it's not just about the sports side, it's having all those additional skills as well to deal with, because they have a huge number of problem behaviours. But in a sense, it's operating separately from their peers. Seems to be a key factor to us.
I've got a question to ask here. I've had some friends over from Scandinavia, and they were horrified to see what goes in a shopping trolley in the UK. My question is, who is benefiting from this obesity? Those are the ones we should be targeting. Large companies who actually make money out of people being obese.
I wouldn't say they make money out of people being obese.
They create it then. They create it by selling extra this, extra that, and
Well,
the food
I
products are terrible.
suppose that's a different conversation. And the conversation we're having here is about sport, sports coaching, and how we can do a better job in working with young people in that environment, okay? And I would say that all 100% of kids are exposed to the same environment you're just describing, and yet 1 in 3 have a problem. So the reality is that they are more vulnerable. And I think we should be treating them as more vulnerable and offering them solutions for them. Not just considering we'll change supermarkets. It's just a different conversation. Or change fast food. It is a different conversation.
Buying into everything you say, by the way, despite the earlier question. We've got a move to develop the whole child, to have a whole school approach, but there's still, under Mr. Gove, there's always the gifted and talented element. If I've got it right, Paul, what you're really saying is the quality and the focus we give to the elite performers is equally important for the obese group as a category, because when you do bring them together, you get different synergies, different relationships. Unfortunately, you've got that politically correct sensitivity around actually establishing that group. But if you don't make that transfer, nothing is going to change. Is that a fair assumption?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I've got a lot of sympathy with that.
And I think, that whole... what's interesting is that by not doing what you've just described and carving that group out and really investing in them, they are a huge drain to our economy, a huge drain. So if I were to talk through the sort of dimensions in which these young people cost, obesity currently is costing our economy £35 billion a year. That's about £7 billion in the health costs, and it's about another 28 billion in social costs, lost productivity, welfare. So in our adult services we run, 50% of our participants who are significantly obese are unemployed. They have 60% of them have mental health problems. We're seeing a doctor every day. So all of those factors are the consequences of not doing what you've just described, or what I would argue is there should be done. And is what he's done. If we take sport as an example, if we take sport investment leading up to the Olympics, we spent 100 million on 1,000 people. If we spent the same 100 million on 1,000 obese kids, we would save ourselves a lot of money in the future. Thank you very much.